Good morning. Today is Thursday, July the 16th, and today we are going to start the second chapter and unit in your textbook, which is all about neuroscience. And we'll start this discussion with talks about what exactly are neurons. All right, now, why is this important? All right, isn't this a psychology class? Well, in reality, psychology is definitely very closely related to biology. In order to understand how our mental processes and thoughts and memories and that sort of thing work, we really do need to understand the structure, the biological structure of the brain and the rest of the nervous system. Now, the neuron, which is the title of the first section of chapter 2, is the cell that makes up the nervous system. And so in today's this video, which is the first of 3 videos, by the way, we'll cover and go through the structure of neurons. Okay, so what does nervous tissue actually do? All right, nervous tissue is simply a collection of these nerve cells, the cells that make up the nervous system, and its major function is to allow for communication between cells. Okay, so cells all over your body are actually going to talk to each other, and this is, in essence, a 3-step process. All right, and I want you to pay very careful attention to this. We've got sensory input, integration or processing of data, and then motor output. Okay, so 3 stages: input, processing or integration, and then output. Now, and remember that, because we're going to talk about this at different levels of the nervous system. We'll start with the simplest level and the simplest layer, which is the individual cell that makes up the nervous system. And these cells are called neurons. Okay, now neurons are composed of 3 parts. All right, you've got the cell body, which is this part right here. Okay, and this is the middle of the cell, and it contains all of the organelles and the other important aspects that help to keep the cell alive. If you remember from your high school biology class, this contains the mitochondria and the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticula and all of those kinds of things. Okay. But in terms of the other 2 aspects, sensory input and motor output, there are also other parts to the cell. Up here, and you can see this right here, this is a dendrite, right? You can see it labeled right there. And the dendrites are responsible for taking in information. They grab information either from your sensory organs, like your eyes or your ears or your tongue, that sort of thing, your skin, and they send it to the cell body. Okay, the cell body then processes the information and determines whether or not a signal needs to be sent to another part of the body. And if the signal does need to be sent, we send it through an axon. And this long tail of the nerve cell is the axon. And it's designed to carry information away from the cell body. So there's the output version. All right. So again, input, processing, output. Okay. The dendrites are responsible for the input. The cell body is responsible for the processing, and the axon is responsible for the output. Now, the nervous system is not just made of nerve cells, all right? And in the previous slide, you may have noticed that there were a couple of other weird-looking kinds of cells in there. The neurons themselves are the nervous cells that actually transmit the information inside the nervous system. And so these are obviously the most important cells. But there are also a number of other cells in the nervous system called glial cells, and you can see those listed here. And these are essentially support cells. They do all sorts of things for the nervous system. They help to nourish and support and protect the nervous system. If we go back for just a moment, you can see several different kinds. There are astrocytes here. That's the one that's represented by the green cell here. These guys are responsible for nourishing the cells. Notice that the astrocyte is connected to a blood capillary. And so they're pulling sugar and other nutrients out of the blood and delivering it to the neurons. Whoops. The oligodendrocytes, which are here, is this white cell represented here, and they're responsible for producing a covering on the axon. And we'll talk about the covering is called the myelin sheath, and we'll talk about what that does a little bit in more detail a little bit later on. And then finally, over here, you see lots of little microglia, which are cells that actually help to protect the nervous system from things like bacterial infections. They hunt down and destroy bacteria, viruses, and other things that can infect and cause disease within the nervous system. All right, so the nervous system is not just neurons. There's also neuroglia. And by the way, the neuroglia outnumber the neurons 9-to-1. So for every neuron you've got in your body, there are approximately nine glial cells. Okay, and that's what we're talking about here: the glial cells that support the neurons in the nervous system. Okay, so let's talk about the parts of the neuron in a little bit more detail. On the right-hand side of the screen, obviously, there's the same picture that you saw a few slides ago. But in this case, let's define exactly what the three major parts of a neuron are. We start with the dendrites, all right? These are fibers that project out of the cell body of a neuron, whose function is to receive information from other neurons. Now, these other neurons could be the sensory receptors in your eyes or your tongue or your nose, all right? But they could also just be receiving information from other neurons, regular neurons. For example, inside the brain, your entire brain is composed of nerve cells, neurons. And they're talking to each other all the time. There's a great deal of communication there. And it's the dendrites that are receiving information, not just necessarily from one cell, but possibly from, tens or even hundreds of other cells at the same time. So they're coordinating all of the information that's coming in to the neuron. The cell body itself is the part of the neuron that contains all of the biological tools that any cell needs. This includes the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi bodies, the mitochondria, the ribosomes, all the little organelles that you learned about, hopefully, in your high school biology classes. Those aren't necessarily terribly important for our conversation today, but just know that a nerve cell is just like any other cell in your body, that it does need those things in order to keep it alive. The important function of the cell body is the decision-making process. In other words, they take in the information from the dendrites and they decide whether or not it's necessary to send a signal to the next cell down the line. And so there's a processing that goes on, and integration of information that goes on within the cell body whether or not a signal needs to be sent to the next cell down the line. Now, if a signal is sent, it goes through the axon. And the axon is a long, but only one fiber, all right? Whereas the dendrites there's hundreds or even thousands of dendrites on a given neuron. There's only one axon. And it's a long singular fiber projecting out of the cell body, whose function it is to conduct a neural impulse from the cell body all the way down to the axon terminals. And at those axon terminals is either another neuron or maybe a muscle cell or a gland or some other organ that's going to then receive the signal. Now, not to think that all neurons are exactly the same, because they're not, okay? Neurons actually come in 3 different flavors. We have sensory neurons, which are the ones that take impulses from sensory receptors and send them to the central nervous system. Now, we'll talk about senses a little bit more in a future discussion, but your senses are your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nose, and your skin. Now, probably in your kindergarten class, you learned that there are 5 senses. Right? In reality, that's not true. There's certainly the big 4. All right, sight, sound, taste, and smell. But the sense of touch is actually composed of 15 or 20 different things. Think about all the different things that you can determine with your fingers, right? You can determine whether something is hot or cold, smooth or rough, sharp or dull, all right? And a whole host of other kinds of things. And so there's lots and lots of different kinds of sensory neurons in your skin, as well as your eyes, ears, nose, and tongue. Now, the interneurons are the ones that are receiving information inside the central nervous system. CNS is central nervous system. And that the central nervous system is your brain or your spinal cord. And so this is where the integration takes place. So remember, input, integration, output. The sensory neurons are for input. The interneurons are for the integration or the processing of data. And so they take in all of the information, and your brain or maybe spinal cord then processes that information and makes a decision as to what needs to be done to respond to whatever stimulus there is. And the response is then carried by what we call a motor neuron, which takes an impulse from the brain or the spinal cord of the central nervous system and sends it to an effector. All right. Now, your effectors are, there's many different kinds of effectors, but the most common ones are glands somewhere in the body that release some kind of fluid or hormone or whatever it happens to be, or a muscle fiber. All right. When you want to, for example, flex your muscles, that the result of that is because of a motor neuron that has sent an impulse from the brain to the spinal cord. Now, have a look at this picture here, because this illustrates the 3 different kinds of neurons, all right? And I'll generally sketch them out. This right here is a sensory neuron, okay? And so notice that the sensory receptors here, all right, these are the dendrites over here. And these specialized dendrites could be the rods and cones in your eyes. They could be the root hairs in your cochlea in your ears. They could be taste buds on your tongue or olfactory receptors in your nose. But they're sensory receptors, all right? They then take signals in, all right? So they're responsible for the input, and they send a signal down to the cell body, all right, which is represented here. All right, the cell body determines whether a signal needs to be sent to the central nervous system or not, and if so, then that signal is then sent down the axon until it reaches the next nerve cell. Now, the next nerve cell are the interneurons, okay, which are here. And the interneurons are mostly found in the brain and the spinal cord, all right? Notice they're very short, very much more compact than the sensory or motor neurons. But they do have a great number of dendrites to receive information from other cells, and then one axon, which sends information out. And again, 3 processes: input through the dendrites, processing through the cell body, and output through the axon. Now, if a response is required to a certain stimulus, then we use the motor neuron, which is represented here. Okay. And the motor neuron, again, is composed of multiple dendrites, all right? So they receive signals from multiple interneurons, and those signals come in, they go into the cell body, which is represented here, and then if they need to send that message to a muscle or a gland or some other part of the body, they will send a signal all the way down through the axon to the axon terminals. And so the axon terminals here, notice, are branched, and so one nerve fiber can stimulate many muscle cells. Okay. Now, so again, 3 different kinds of neurons, and each one of them has input, integration, output, input, integration, output, input, integration, output. Okay, but generally speaking, the sensory neurons, their main goal is input. Interneurons is mostly for integration, and motor neurons are mostly for output. Okay, all right. So how do neurons actually communicate? How do they send signals from one place in the body to another? All right, well, it turns out that those messages are partly electrical. Yeah, believe it or not, little electrical signals are being sent all through your body all the time. And then they are partly chemical as well. It turns out that inside the neuron, the message is almost solely electrical. Now, I don't mean that this is electrical like you find in the wire connected to a lamp or a cell phone or a computer. All right, it's more of a chemical electrical charge. If you took high school chemistry, you should know what an ion is. Ions are charged atoms, right? Because they either have too many or too few electrons, all right, and that unbalances the amount of charge that they have. But that relative charge is then sent all through the dendrites and the cell body and the axon in order to send the signal from one end to the other. Now, there is a change when you reach the end of the axon because there's a space that exists between one neuron and the next. And so the electrical signal can't jump from one neuron to the next. And so it has to be converted into a chemical message that then diffuses across the gap and then stimulates a new electrical signal in the next neuron. All right. And we'll go through the details of how all of that works in just a little while. All right. But so here, there's a little section right there where there's a space that the electrical signal from the sensory neuron has to be converted to a chemical signal, which is then converted to an electrical signal in the interneuron. And again, here, right here, all right, there's the electrical signal is converted to a chemical signal, which is then jumps across the gap and is converted back to an electrical signal. And then down here at the axon terminals, the same thing happens again. Okay. All right. So neurons are constantly sending electrical and chemical signals from one end to the other, from your sense organs to your brain, and then back to a muscle or a gland or something along those lines. Now, within an individual neuron, the signals are electrical. And so neurons receive signals from other neurons through their dendrites. All right, we've already kind of covered that. But the one thing that we didn't say was that the signals can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Now, an excitatory impulse is one that tells the cell body, yeah, we got to respond to this. You got to send this signal onward. Okay, and so if it's excitatory, an impulse will be then sent down the axon. On the other hand, if it's an inhibitory signal, that means that the cell body will not generate a new electrical impulse. It won't send a signal. And both of these things happen all the time. A couple of other things that you should know is that the impulses are either all or nothing. All right, either a signal is sent or it's not. There's not weak signals and strong signals. There's not fast signals and slow signals. It's either the signal is sent or the signal is not. Okay, and that decision is made at the cell body level. All right, the dendrites take in the impulse. The cell body then says, am I excited about this? Do I need to send a message to the down the axon, or am I not? And I'm just going to shut this whole thing down. Okay, so the impulses are all or nothing. Now, that may ask you to question, well, what about the stimulus intensity? What happens if if Dr. Rapp is whispering, or if he's screaming into the computer? All right, what's the difference in those the sounds that you're receiving in your ear? Well, that has to do with the number of neurons that are actually generating impulses. All right, for example, the louder a sound, or the brighter the light, or the stronger the smell or the taste, the more neurons are being stimulated, and therefore that amplifies the signal. All right, if I'm whispering, or I'm sitting in a dark room, or you get a very weak taste, that means that fewer neurons are stimulated. However, any neurons that are stimulated send a signal with the same intensity. All right, again, the impulses are all or nothing. Either the neuron is stimulated or it's not. Okay, now this is a video on what we call the action potential, and we're gonna end the first of 3 videos here. But what I do want you to keep in mind is that the action potential is essentially voltage, and we put voltage on this axis over here. And what happens is the voltage starts out very, very low, and if there's a stimulus, the voltage goes up, back down. Notice it goes down lower, and then through. Okay, and so the video describes what actually happens in each of these parts. Okay, so you can't watch the video through this video, but I have uploaded the PowerPoint, so make sure that you download that onto your computers, and then click on the hyperlink that you see here, and that will help us to get through our discussion of the action potential. All right, so that is where I'm going to leave it for this particular video. Stay tuned for the next video, and I hope that you learned something.